Whole Hope, The Idolized and Realistic by O.G. Rose. Humans hope. Through imagination and projection, humans constantly try to surround themselves with what they've always wanted and or what they've always been looking for. This is easy to do, since I, like all humans, am often surrounded by that which, relative to me, lacks reality. There is plenty of room for imagination. My life, consciousness, is the only one that's reality I must really wrestle with. I do not have to deal with the consciousness of anyone else. I must wrestle with my own thoughts and insecurities, but I don't have to wrestle with yours. Yes, people can share with me what they are going through, but it is not possible for me to experience what they are going through the same way they do. I can empathize with others, but I cannot experience their consciousness. Hence, though I can know about the imperfections and shortcomings of others, it is only my own that I can experience and wrestle with in full. Consequently, everyone else can easily appear to be free of wrestling with anything. They can easily appear to be living idolized lives, affirming that my life is the only one filled with difficulties, misunderstandings, and so forth, that no one else grapples with or even understands. And so the lives of others can come to be my source of hope, my justification for living, a hope I can never achieve, stuck in my own consciousness. At the same time, the lives of others can also come to be my reason for discontent with my own life. Ironically, if I could inhabit the consciousness of others, I would suddenly find that reality is present there just as much as it is present in my own life. The idolized perfection I imagined is nowhere to be found. Outside, I could imagine perfection. Inside, my imagination can no longer envision perfection without being in denial versus in ignorance. Conversely, it can also be easy to over-criticize or under-idolize, per se, the lives of others, thinking I have it way better than them. Since only I can experience my life in full, I am in a position to think my life is full of that which no one else has, and so come to take too much pride and hope in myself. I can ignore the realities of my life and pretend like everything is good when it isn't so grand, though that isn't to say my life can't be good, resulting in me living in denial. And so my life can come to be my own source of hope, my justification for living, which could be ruined as soon as reality and the unexpected set in. If I am dealing with sadness, I can never know if the sadness another person is dealing with is less, equal, or greater than my own. There is always the possibility that they have no idea what I am going through, or that they have it worse than me, so I should be positive, and so on. Looking at a picture of Europe, I can think I've always wanted to go there, possibly implying that there's something in Europe which I cannot get or find where I currently live. Perhaps it's just a new experience, and it should be noted that there is nothing inherently wrong with visiting Europe. However, if I'm trying to escape to Europe, if Europe has become my source of hope, I indulge in whole hope, H-O-L-E, hope, instead of whole hope, W-H-O-L-E, hope, as will be expanded on. My marriage is the only marriage that's reality I will have to wrestle with. Everyone else's marriage will be experienced free of its whole reality. Stuck in myself, I will not be able to deny the realities of my marriage, such as the fact that my snoring at night keeps my wife up, our jobs consume time, we could spend romancing one another, and so forth. But I can be ignorant of the realities of other marriages. Hence, in seeing other marriages or romantic relationships generally, I'll be able to imagine how wonderful they are without having to think about their imperfections. Yes, I may mentally assent to no marriage being perfect, but not being able to experience the imperfections of any other marriage than my own, this mental assent will have less, if any, emotional or experiential weight, especially against the emotional butterflies I could get when daydreaming and or imagining an idolized life. Perhaps this is why adultery can happen to so many. Yes, I may know nothing is perfect, but it is only my life in which the imperfections of life are emotionally and experientially felt. The imperfections of other lives I can only mentally assent to. I cannot experience and or feel them in full. Hence, there is always room for hope, for there is always room for imagination. Hence, I can always turn others into sources of hope, and in doing so, create for myself whole hope, H-O-L-E, instead of whole hope, H-W-H-O-L-E, a possibly terrible temptation. Section 1. To live is to be conscious. It is to inhabit a mode of being and thinking. It is to hold a set of memories. It is to experience a wide range of emotions. It is to know a wide range of people and things. Everyone who is conscious experiences such things, but only you experience what you experience and how you experience it. This helps constitute yourself, and you can never inhabit the self of another. Hence, there is a gap between you and others, a sort of hole, H-O-L-E, in others that you don't have in yourself. What that hole of yours is filled with memories, experience, emotions, and so forth, with reality, if you will. The holes of others are not so filled relative to you, because only they fill those holes relative to themselves with their memories, experiences, emotions, and so forth. Relative to everyone else, the holes of others are unfilled. In these spaces, people can project ideas, dreams, and their imaginations, while they cannot so project them into themselves. This is because their holes are filled by their reality, a reality brought into them by consciousness. By virtue of being conscious, a person cannot fill his or her own hole with imagination, unimpeded by reality, but a person can fill the holes of others. A similar logic applies to things and experiences. In everything there is a hole, but once we encounter and or realize that thing, that hole is filled to some degree, even if it is filled with a feeling of emptiness. For the person who has been to Paris, Paris is a more filled hole than it is to someone who has never been to Paris. For someone who has been a famous actor, being an actor is a more filled hole than it is to someone who has never been an actor. The examples go on. This isn't to say Paris or acting can't be wonderful to those who have filled those holes. That depends on the person, and you have to be that person to know. But rather, it is simply to say that these things are no longer holes, that it is no longer possible to project into them as much imagination as once was possible, that reality has filled them to some degree. Reality has taken up the space. Whether or not this is good or bad, is a good or bad thing, depends on the person. My point is simply that whole hope occurs. What is reality? That depends on the person. However, there are constants shared by people and realities that can be pointed to, that can be pointed out. In particular, the general constant that I would like to note is that no reality is perfect, that all realities consist of not just positives and not just negatives, but both negatives and positives. Everyone has advantages that other people do not have, as everyone possesses disadvantages that others are free from. This logic applies to all lifestyles, jobs, talents, and so on. Nothing is perfect. Everything is a mixture of the good and the bad. If one is a doctor, one is perhaps respected in earning a good salary, but one can also be stressed and depressed, as depicted in The Best is the Best by O.G. Rose. To be poor is to suffer a lack of money and basic necessities, but to be rich can be to wrestle with people's envy and the emotional experience of the truth that money doesn't buy happiness. To be an artist is to get to experience oneself, to express oneself, but it is also to be misunderstood by people who don't value art, and so on. There are pluses and minuses to everything. No reality escapes this truth. But where there is a hole, where reality is yet to dwell, relatively speaking, we can imagine otherwise. For though we may intellectually know that nothing is perfect, we can lack experiential knowledge, which is much more powerful. Ideas are not experiences, after all. Hence, where there are holes, we can create hope for ourselves, whole hope. And we can do this constantly. Whole hope tends to be everywhere. Section 2. When we see a marriage or relationship that isn't ours, we can imagine that it is perfect, or at least better off. The lack of reality so permits us, while at the same time we cannot so imagine our own marriage without confronting reality. When we see a couple walking down a street holding hands, we can imagine that they are feeling the feelings we always dreamt we'd feel when we were in a relationship, a feeling we perhaps learned we were supposed to feel in the right relationship from movies and novels. When we look at a house we don't live in, whether it be in a magazine or down the street, we can think about how much happier we'd be living there. The pipes wouldn't leak as often, the children wouldn't get in as many fights, each having their own room, and the tablecloths and furnishings would be more beautiful, and so on. When we see a person boarding a plane, whether in real life or in a movie, we can think about all the wonderful places they may visit, places we've always wanted to see, places that would be much more exciting than the banal places where we live. Upon the people we are not, we can imagine a story and give ourselves the whole hope of a different life. Regardless what it is, that which we don't realize into our reality is that which can function as a whole hope relative to us. And we often do this to the mysteries that surround us without us even realizing we're doing it. Hope comes naturally. We cannot imagine where we live without our imaginations being infringed upon by reality. Living there, at best, we can imagine it unrealistically and or in denial. But when we visit a friend's house, we can imagine it without doing so unrealistically, not living there to fill it with reality, or in denial, for we don't have any standard to be in denial of. As a result, there is a hole, a place or reality, or our reality does not fully occupy, that enables us to idolize life without being in any sort of denial, for when we are in ignorance, we cannot also be in denial. And so, at a friend's house, we can indulge in thoughts about how perfect their life must be, about how they probably never have to clean as much as we do, about how their furniture never gets old, about all the picturesque meals they must have in their dining room, and so on. Not living there, we cannot know for sure. Rather, our imagination is inaccurate, and so stuck in possibility. We can imagine it however we want without knowing that we know better. However, we cannot idolize our own homes without knowing that we know better, having experienced the realities that everyone else, relative to their own conditions, experience, with all the joys and hardships. Hence, our reality is, in a way, handicapped in comparison to our friend's life. We cannot idolize our lives without doing so in denial of reality. While we can idolize the life of our friend freely because we are in ignorance, and often, unfortunately, this whole hope is how we keep ourselves motivated to live our lives without sinking into despair. If our own parents are overbearing, when we visit another family, we can be quick to think those parents are perfect and wish our parents were like them. We can forget that most people naturally put on their best face when around people they don't know, and not living with the other parents on a daily basis, we lack the real experiences that can check and balance our idolization and imagination. Hence, we can come to think the solution to our problems would be to have different parents like these, when really the solution might be to tell our parents how overbearing they can be, to lovingly confront them. Such stands are hard, though, and relishing in whole hope much easier. We gravitate toward the easy, a nature that can keep us from actually improving the quality of our lives. We naturally prefer wholes to action. Additionally, we can come to depend on wholes, for they give us hope to keep going. Believing that if I had different parents, life would be better, even though we don't have those parents, just knowing those idolized parents supposedly exist out there somewhere can give us hope to keep living, hope that the world isn't all that bad. Yet no parents are perfect, and the parents that give us whole hope today, a year later, may end up being just as overbearing, divorced, and so forth. Not living with them, we don't know what realities they hide from us and other outsiders, and if they end up divorced, being the source of our whole hope, we may be devastated and sink into further despair, having lost the motivation to combat the original despair from which we sought escape. To whole hope is to put ourselves at risk of devastation upon encountering reality. Section 3. There are many subtle manifestations of whole hope that happen unnoticed around us. When a person claims there are problems with a house, the person can suggest that it is possible for a house to exist that doesn't have these problems, or that it is possible to exist in a state in which these problems were not thought of as problems, and so create a space in which to imagine such. Hence, there exists the possibility of a better state. Hence, there is hope. In saying there are problems with a house or insert, people can give themselves whole hope. Likewise, when a person says that house is perfect or insert is perfect, the person suggests that there is a perfect state non-perfect houses or, so forth can achieve, and so there is hope for the fallible, of which the person can imagine entities achieving. The person who says, I'm stressed, implies that there exists the possibility of a state in which one isn't stressed. Relative to that person, the life where he or she isn't stressed is a whole, one into which the person can project and imagine perfection. Additionally, the person who says, I'm stressed, may hope to be validated by others for working so hard, and since the other minds can be occupied, others are wholes can't be occupied. Others are wholes in which the person can imagine validating thoughts. If a person who owns a company declares, I run this place, the act of declaring this to others can be a hope that he or she will be affirmed in being the boss, and this act can create space in which the person can imagine others affirming the boss in this. Even if we don't mean the statement this way, the statement is married to the possibility of being a whole hope, and so a space which the imagination can fill. If we declare, I'm a musician, we utter a claim that cannot be separated from the possibility of being a whole hope for being affirmed in our occupation. All claims of which imply the possibility of affirmation are inseparable from the possibility of being a whole hope, suggesting we need to pay close attention to our motives. The person who lives to provide for his children may use his children as a whole into which to project hopes. This isn't to say children are bad and that people shouldn't provide for them, only that children can easily turn into holes in spaces into which parents can imagine hopes that give their lives meaning, putting an unbearable weight on the children's shoulders. If a person believes that by living a certain way he or she will live a happy life, the person has created both a ritual by which to achieve happiness, believing that in doing certain things a certain outcome will emerge, and a space into which to project the idolizations of his or her imagination. People who think everyone should stay single, should get married, should be scientific, should be philosophical, should travel, so on. All these people create whole hopes, for they all create rituals people can carry out, like someone with OCD, and so achieve what he or she wants. Section 4. Suffering can beget whole hope, both because humans can take pride in suffering and because suffering can motivate us to imagine an unrealistic world without it. Knowing we have more work to do than others, even though we may complain about it, can give us a feeling of superiority, not necessarily, but possibly. Knowing we are busier, that we have less free time, that we work more, and so forth, can make us feel superior to those who aren't suffering like us. Additionally, to say, you have no idea what I'm going through, can also be to say, there exists a state of being that is much better off than mine, hence there is hope. And even if I can't achieve that hope, just knowing it is possibly out there can give me reason to keep living. To say I'm always so busy can be to say, it's not right for me to have to be this busy. And or, there is a state in which a person can be less busy, hence there is hope. To say I'm sick can be to say I have a disorder, and or there is a possible state in which a person doesn't have depression, hence there is hope. Claims of suffering can have embedded in them claims of hope. Even the nihilist who claims nothing matters can say nothing is everything, and hence everything matters, hence there is hope. When we suffer, it's natural for us to then project out into the world states of being that we can put our hope in. Hence, sufferers can easily slip into whole hope of imagining and idolizing a state unlike theirs. Now, this isn't to say everyone who suffers projects or that everyone who talks about suffering shouldn't. Rather, it is to say that suffering easily leads to idolizing and imagining a state free of suffering. In reality, though, there is no state that is totally free of hardship. Yes, there are states that are perhaps better than others, but there is no state in reality that isn't a mixture of the good and the bad. If during times of suffering we forget this, which can be easy to do, then when we escape this suffering we may experience disillusionment when we eventually find suffering yet again. Keeping us in a state of always being toward a whole hope rather than achieving any authentic life. Once we move out of a state, we can retrospectively treat it as a whole hope, now not being present in the state to check and balance our idolization with reality. Once we graduate from college, though not a whole, while actually attending it, it can suddenly become a whole again, as college could have been before we attended it. And now we can fill the hole with our idolizations, as we can also fill it with our memories, perhaps while wearing rose-colored glasses. Even though we can no longer attend it, just the knowledge that there exists in the world a state of such wonder, which we believe unrealistically that we experienced, can help us get through the day. Of course, when we idolize college, we overlook the negative experiences we had during it, perhaps the breakups, the terrible classes, the sleepless nights studying, and recall only the good, which makes college appear to us much better than it was in actuality. Not being in college anymore, we may have the space and or hold to do that, as we do once we get older in regard to our childhoods, our high schools, and so on. No longer there in those states to fill them with our realities, our imaginations can run unimpeded like a river in which there are no rocks for the water to hit up against. And the temptation to always live toward holes in which our idolizations can roam freely can prove difficult to resist, seeing as the only alternative is to embrace reality, which entails trade-offs between and a mixture of the good and the bad, while the idolized consists only of the good. But it is only by facing reality that we can achieve whole hope, as will be expounded upon. And that's with a W. There is a sense in which to have whole hope is to live vicariously, either through others, imagined others, or an imagined self. In this sense, vicarious living might be the most prevalent way to live. Anytime we idolize, we live vicariously. This isn't to say all idolization and imagination is bad. In fact, there is a degree of it that we require in order to be creative and to make the world a better place. But it is to say that whenever vicarious living comes to replace living, we have stumbled into a hole in which we fail to live realistically, cutting us off from the possibility of whole hope, as will be expounded on. When we walk into a neighbor's house and imagine how perfect their lives must be compared to our realistic lives, our lives that we cannot fill with idolizations without those idolizations realizations, encountering the realities we live through. In that moment, we vicariously live through imagined versions of our neighbors. When we think of how great it would be to travel, we vicariously live through a version of ourselves in our minds that is climbing the Alps, as we do when we idolize being a banker, a professional football player, someone who's not married to our spouse, someone who's attending a different college. The list goes on. Like the person who lives for his football team or favorite celebrity, we can vicariously live through our imaginations in the imagined celebrity version of ourselves. Where there is a whole hope, there is vicarious living. Where there is holistic hope, there is living. This has been part 1 of Whole Hope. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.